to speak with Thane Rosenbaum. Thane Rosenbaum is a novelist, essayist, prolific columnist, law professor, distinguished university professor at Touro College, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. 10 years ago, he wrote The Myth of Moral Justice, Why Our Legal System Fails to Do What's Right. Then 10 years later, in my opinion, in a sequel-like fashion, he came out with Saving Free Speech from Itself, which for me is another chapter describing the problems with the legal system in simple terms that even I'm able to understand. Early this week, he penned Woke Terrorism in White Rose magazine. This is a must-read for everyone, regardless of pre-existing bias or political persuasion. Find it on whiterose.com. So Thane, welcome back. I'm going to propose a few questions to you, and we'll get you up there. Hi, Thane. How are you?
Hey, Gary. I'm always happy to do your show. Thank you.
And we love having you. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I'm going to get off screen, just let you answer them until you've said what you feel is important. So basically, here's the question.
Giving me room to run. I see. Thank you.
Exactly. So the questions are, and again, I'm going to propose three questions, but I'm going to propose them as one long question for the reasons of efficiency. And so number one is, why are BDS and the other pro-Palestinian and anti-Semitic groups so much better at marketing themselves to the masses than we are? As a caveat to that question, why does Hamas get a break? And thirdly and lastly is why, if a white man held hostages in a black church, it would still be a hot topic for days, weeks, months, and forever, basically. Yet the recent Islamo-fascist terrorists in a Texas temple story seem to have expired overnight. So Thane, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if I had a podcast with you, I would call it Just Thane. So Just Thane, here he goes.
Well, Gary, let me just say that in our political culture, it is extremely unfashionable for Jews to be regarded as victims. It just doesn't fit into the new political narrative. And there's, as I point out in this White Rose essay, the hard left has invested an enormous amount of political capital in creating these hierarchies of oppression in which everything is judged by skin color. And Jews are in the category of oppressors. And that's why you see these very strange alliances in the intersectional community that never include Jews, and why Jews are always asked to give loyalty oaths that they can't be pro-Israel, because by doing so, they're automatically considered racist. So the hard left's emphasis on skin color has put Jews in this, unwinnable situation where they're clearly a minority. As I point out in the White Rose essay, no matter where you are, when FBI statistics, annual statistics, the hate crimes against Jews are disproportionately higher than any other racial or ethnic category by very wide margins every year. And yet, again, that idea that hate crimes really is a crime that affects Jews is something that doesn't fit into this new political culture that we live in, which is exactly why the hostage taking in Texas was essentially a non-story, because the person was a Muslim, and his Islamist credentials didn't matter at that point, which is exactly why both the FBI and even President Biden fumbled so early. It's only now that the FBI is finally sort of making what is the most obvious linkage between an Islamist who's calling for the release of a woman named as the Lady Al-Qaeda, who blamed her prosecution on Jews and insisted that all the jurors take a DNA test to prove that they were all Jews. In fact, I'm pretty sure none of them were Jews. And so somehow the FBI was confused and saying, well, we don't really see how this has anything to do with Jews. It reminded me of something that President Obama said after the kosher market killings in 2015. It was really just appalling when President Obama said, he described that incident as a bunch of folks, he called them folks, who were randomly selected by a zealot. What? They're not folks, they're Jews. They were not random, they were targeted because they were Jews. And the zealot was an Islamist. And it's interesting how the president, again, who was a disappointment to progressives, but his heart was always in the right place for progressives. You know, you can see how Obama was struggling with that, because the way he recharacterized what happened in a kosher market. So he forgot that it was a kosher market. He forgot that there were Jews. He seemed to think it was random, and he had no understanding about why these people were being targeted. That's exactly what the FBI just did in Texas. So all of a sudden, it was an act of terror, but we have no connection between the Islamist and the community that he was targeting. And, you know, we know from the 1960s, with the rise of the PLO, that terrorism, it was sort of perfected as an anti-Israel strategy. And the vast majority of victims of terrorism have always been Jews and Israelis all over the world, including Buenos Aires, where I point out, you know, I think it was 385 people were killed. This was the Iran, the blowing up of the JCC in Buenos Aires in 1985. In the essay that I in the White Rose, I give you a partial list of all the attacks against Jews, certainly throughout France and other countries, just in the last 10 years alone. The 2 women in Paris, the 4 people in the Jewish day school in Toulouse, Ilan Halimi in Paris. And yet, when it came to the press's coverage of what happened in Texas, none of those stories mattered. And the reason it doesn't matter is, now again, it only matters if it's a white supremacist who's attacking Jews. Jews can only earn back their minority status. They can be divested of their white privilege only if they're attacked by a Trump supporter or a white supremacist. If you're attacked by a white supremacist, then all of a sudden Jews are a poor minority group. But we have seen this now for a number of years. Jews were attacked in New York in the Diamond District. This was just last May in the aftermath of the Gaza campaign in Israel. They were attacked in Los Angeles, in Miami, and the press wasn't interested in the story. It just was a non-story. Why? Because pro-Palestinian sympathizers were the ones that were doing the targeting. Just before the pandemic, November and December of 2019, here in New York, in Williamsburg, in Muncie, New York, and in Jersey City, New Jersey, Orthodox Jews were attacked by Black nationalists. Story, nobody cared about it. It was just not captured. It certainly didn't make any front page and didn't last as a story at all. No one wanted to talk about it. It was politically incorrect to even mention the fact that Jews were being killed by people of color. So look, that's what's in the essay that you seem to have identified. In terms of the first 2 questions, you know, I wrote an essay years ago for the Times of Israel. I think it was called The Palestinian Pass. So you can find it. It's called The Palestinian Pass. It was in Times of Israel. And I point out about how it is true that the emphasis is always, you know, like when the stabbing intifada, right? The stories were always reported that IDF soldiers were shooting Palestinians. And the story about the fact that the Palestinians had knives and had been attacking people in the old city outside of Damascus Gate never was part of the story. In fact, you may remember there were those extraordinary incidences where the photographers took pictures of the crime scene but kicked the knives away because no one's supposed to see the knife. It can only be shown as what? Jews as oppressors. That is just part of the intersectional woke narrative. And it's been emphasized over the last several years, and that's why that story is just the story in Texas was inconvenient on every level. It focused on anti-Semitism, which is always being downplayed in our political culture, and although the assailant was an Islamist, because he was Muslim and a person of color, it was much harder for the press to give it a fair coverage. And that's the only explanation. Now, why is it that Hamas gets a pass? Well, again, I've written about this. It can only be one thing. It's anti-Semitism. The world doesn't seem to care when Arabs kill Arabs. Arabs kill Arabs in, extraordinary numbers. I mean, if you think about Yemen and Syria and Iraq, civil wars in which, tens of thousands in Syria, it's 500,000 Syrians were killed in a civil war. The world could care less when, Arabs kill Arabs, but only if a Jew kills an Arab, it's a war crime, no matter where it is, no matter even if it's in self-defense, even if it's part of the rules of engagement under war, circumstances of war. It doesn't matter. Jews can't kill Arabs in our political culture. To answer your first question, I would say that Israel only had that, what I would say, the sort of the spunk of the underdog, which was just shortly after the 6-Day War. Israel's entire history has been one that, although they were always surrounded by enemies, no one, and even though they were essentially a socialist country until the late 1970s, very few other countries were ever supporting them. It was just so interesting in the days for decades. Israel's only friends were South Africa and Iran. People forget this. Great little anecdote. Israel had few friends. It had the Shah of Iran. Yes, that's right, Iran. And South Africa, apartheid state. They just didn't have any friends. No one wanted to be their friend in the UN. It hasn't changed. It's better today, of course, with the Abraham Accords. But what I am saying is that people blame what's called Hasbara, the public relations of Israel. I don't know if it's their fault. I just think it's not the fault that Israel doesn't have good public relations. I just think that we're living in a political moment where Jews as victims, including the Holocaust, there's a professor at Oberlin College a few years ago who said that the Holocaust should not be taught in universities because it's merely white-on-white crime. I'll repeat that for your audience so you can hear that and be shocked. Yes, a professor at Oberlin said the Holocaust shouldn't be taught because it's white-on-white crime. What's the implication there? It doesn't count. It doesn't matter. When white people kill each other, it doesn't matter. These are not crimes. And so that is really the answer to, it's a dark answer. It's not one that is in any way satisfying, but it is part of the woke intersectional moment in our political culture, that everything is decided by skin color. Everything by skin color is decided by the hierarchies of oppression. White people are eternally guilty of crimes committed against people of color. Jews are completely get the status of white privileged people. And so therefore, we discount the Holocaust. We discount the hate crimes. We discount the history of 2,000 years of persecution. We discount everything. And then, of course, we both deny the history. And when it comes to Israel, we distort the history, right? So that Jews have no connection at all to the Holy Land. It's just an accident that the Old Testament mentions Jews and the very cities that are in Israel. It's just an accident. Jews are only there from, Brooklyn and Los Angeles and Paris, and they're not from the Middle East. And this is what's being taught in universities, that idea of land grabbers, white imperialists. And that's the story, and everyone's sticking to it. And you can see that the mainstream media is sticking to this story, and they're very stubborn about it. It took like a week for us now finally to have an honest conversation about, wait a minute, this was an attack against Jews in a house of worship. In fact, they were targeted because they were Jews and because it was a synagogue. This is not the first synagogue attack Again, notice that Pittsburgh and Poway, because of the Tree of Life Synagogue and then the attack in Poway in California, outside of San Diego, those are the only synagogue killings that we're allowed to hear about. And guess what? It's because they were anti-immigrant white supremacists who were blaming Jews for pro-immigration policies of the United States. So the Texas story is not one that fits into that story because the crime was committed by a person of color.
Yeah, I think what's really important is what you do is you define the problem. We know what the problem is. You explain the background of the problem. But now the question, as both a college professor and as well as an attorney, what do we do? What do we do, and what do we tell our children to do in order to somehow get a grasp on this? You made a great point in the article that I read, by the way, how most moderates, and I don't care if you're a liberal or conservative moderate, Democrat, Republican moderate, most of us agree that the right wing and the left wing have gone off the chart. It used to be a little blip on the bell curve. Now it's no longer a blip on the bell curve. So once again, how do we actually get together, those to the right of center, those to the left of center, and form a coalition that realizes that we're the ones who make this country move forward, our country, as well as Israel, as well as Jews. There was a point made by the BDS guy. He basically said that if a Jew is from Morocco, he has nothing to do with Israel, he's Moroccan. Well, then that is saying that if a Chinese person born in America is not Chinese. I mean, I don't get it. Another point that I heard recently is that a 5-year-old white boy is as responsible for slavery as a 5-year-old Japanese girl is responsible for Pearl Harbor. So I want to hear a couple of things, your comment on that, as well as just, tie it together with your recommendations as a professorial person who we all respect. What can we do to change what's happening today?
Well, look, thank you, Gary. The magazine, The White Rose, which you mentioned that ran this recent essay of mine, is dedicated to liberalism. Jews have historically prospered and thrived in liberal cultures. And so that's why I write for this magazine. I hope people will look up The White Rose. It has a historical connection to the Holocaust. Some of your audience members may know. I don't want to get into it, but it has an extraordinary connection to the Holocaust, what the White Rose means and what it symbolizes. But what it does, its purpose as a magazine, is that it's there to defend the principles of liberal culture. And Jews have thrived in such pluralistic, liberal, cosmopolitan societies. The problem is that we're living increasingly in a mean, censorious, angry culture where there's, as we know, divisiveness on the far right and the far left. And it's a culture that is illiberal, anti-democratic, shouting people down, silencing people, canceling people. That's why they call it the cancellation culture. This is not what democracies are, and it's not what liberalism means. America today is not the America of my childhood or even my young adulthood. It's not recognizable, and it has been hijacked by, again, a kind of mean, censorious, anti-democratic, illiberal, angry sensibility that is about judging, as you would say, 5-year-olds, that everyone is responsible for crimes committed against people of color. And in so many ways, first of all, the culture is insisting that it's never been worse for people of color. And it's just absolutely preposterous. It's belied by the facts. We're simply not allowed to talk about the racial progress that not just the world has made, but this country has made, right? It just somehow we're being told by the president, by everyone, that we are ultimately a racist society, that it's systemic. I'm telling you as a law professor, I don't know what that means. People can tell you the word systemic. There is bias and there's prejudice. There's certainly anti-Semitism in the United States. I don't think it's systemic anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semites. There are racists living in this society. But the whole point of the civil rights legislation and various different titles that created fair housing, equal opportunity, affirmative action, public accommodations. All of these are systemic strategies used to combat racism. So yes, there's racism, but the president keeps referring to systemic racism. I just don't know what he's talking about. No one does. We've been told that you should just repeat these words in it because it's very fashionable in our culture to repeat those words, but they have no real meaning. We just elected an African-American president to 2 terms who received more white votes than his predecessor in the Democratic Party, John Kerry, in 2004. That doesn't strike me as Jim Crow. We had 2 African-American secretaries of state back to back, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. This is like what Israel experiences when they're being libeled an apartheid state. You know, Israel's Supreme Court has Arab judges. There's an Ethiopian Miss Israel. This is an apartheid state. You know, again, these are words, terms of art that people are conditioned to repeat. And it really requires, I think, all people of goodwill and honesty and truth to stand up to lying and to not allow these. And part of the problem is that Jews, you know, one of the things I point out in this essay was the rabbi who is now, you know, a hero for a number of reasons, has ultimately lost his job. That story is not being told, that the board of directors had already decided not to renew his contract, and then he resigned. And in a Facebook post, someone pointed out that this rabbi continued to call Israel an apartheid state. Now, I don't know whether that's the reason that he was fired. In my opinion, he should be fired. Yes, I think rabbis who call Israel an apartheid state, that's a libel. It's a blood libel against the only Jewish state in the world and the only democracy in the Middle East. And if the rabbi actually thinks that Israel is an apartheid state, I'm so happy that the board of directors, I know he's now a hero, and what I'm saying now, typical of what I do, is say the thing you're not supposed to say. I'm thrilled that he was fired. He doesn't deserve to be working in any synagogue. No rabbi who calls Israel an apartheid state. It's intellectually bankrupt and just, you know, demonstrably false. So look, I'm very you know, cynical about, you know, fighting this fight. You know, unless you see what I see in mass media, university life, museums, book publishing, you know, the numbers are overwhelming, right? That these falsehoods are just recited automatically, pro forma, and they're very hard to defeat. And I think people of goodwill need to just, you know, recognize that what we're seeing here is illiberal, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic. And we have to be honestly, openly addressing it and rebutting all false charges. But again, what just happened in Texas, what was interesting, was a story that was being told that it's as if to say, don't believe what your eyes saw, just listen to us. This had nothing to do with Jews, because it would be politically unfashionable to think of Jews as victims.
Well, Thane, it's always a pleasure. We appreciate you taking the time. One last comment I'd like to make is I learn a lot about law enforcement by studying every week, watching Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which I've been watching for since it's the longest running TV show in TV history.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
First, Gunsmoke ran 20 seasons. So anyway, they actually had a Christmas Eve episode which showed white supremacists and some black people beating up some Jews. The interesting thing is, and again, I appreciate they even touched on that delicate issue on a fairly liberal show. Mm-hmm. However, they showed it as if the blacks were just some wayward teenagers. They left out the part that there's organized groups of blacks, the black Israelites or Hebrews,
black nationalists,
who aren't just tossing bricks through windows, they're killing us. So they tried, at least they're heading in the right direction. Thane, a closing comment from you, then we'll close it down until tomorrow night.
Well, I'll say this, Gary. Thanks for mentioning that point about that show. In that White Rose essay that I just wrote that you've been referring to, I point out the name Joseph Newman. Joseph Newman is an Orthodox rabbi in Muncie, New York, who in 2019 was stabbed to death 5 times while lighting Hanukkah candles on Hanukkah. Nobody knows his name. A black nationalist drove up from Brooklyn to Muncie, invaded a house, and while the rabbi was lighting candles, he was stabbed 5 times and killed. The rabbi outside in Colleyville, Texas, he will be forever remembered. And he was the one that invited an Islamist into the synagogue and gave him tea. A person who was on the MI5 watch list in the UK, a person who lived in a no-go zone in the UK, and no one will know Joseph Nauman's name. And that's why I gave his name in the essay to say, there's a story that nobody wanted to tell because the victim was an Orthodox Jew, and that doesn't matter at all. And the perpetrator was a black nationalist, and that would be embarrassing to people of color. So let's not tell the story.
Thanks again, Thane, for being with us this evening. And what it's all about is what we can do for our children and their children and onward and forward. So thanks again, Thane. We'll talk to you soon. Checking out for now.
Good night, Gary. Thank you.
Good night, Thane.